how to describe the difference between shells, subshells, orbitals and suborbitals. So imagine that we have an atom of fluorine. Its atomic number is 9, its relative atomic mass is 19, and that means the bottom number, the smaller number, tells us the number of protons and electrons there are in a neutral atom of fluorine. So because this number is 9, we can say an atom of fluorine has 9 electrons, and we also know that these electrons are arranged in shells. So the first shell can take up to 2 electrons, 1, 2, and the second shell can take up to 8 electrons. So the first shell takes 2 electrons, and the second shell takes the 7 electrons that are left over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This shows that fluorine has 9 electrons arranged 2 and then 7. So there are 2 electrons in the first shell and 7 electrons in the outer shell. At A level, each shell is made up of subshells, and these subshells are made of suborbitals. So the first shell, the inner shell, is only made up of one subshell that we call 1s. But the second shell, the outer shell of fluorine, that's the outer ring, is made of 2 different subshells, 2s and 2p. And it's a bit more complicated because the 2p subshell is subdivided into 3 different suborbitals that we call px, py and pz. So the first shell only contains 1s. The second shell is made of a 2s subshell and a 2p subshell. And the 2p subshell is further divided into 2px, 2py and 2pz. Each of these, that, and that, are called suborbitals, and each suborbital can take up to 2 electrons before it gets full. So the first shell contains 2 electrons, and they both go into the 1s subshell, so we write it as 1s2. So those 2 electrons go into 1s2. There are 7 electrons in the second shell, and remember the second shell is made up of 2s and 2p. So the first 2 electrons go in the 2s subshell, so that is 2s2. This shows there are 2 electrons in the 2s subshell. We then fill up with the remaining 5 electrons, because there are 7 electrons there. We've used up 2 electrons here, and they go into the 2px, 2 electrons go in there. The 2py, there were 2 electrons that go in there, and 2pz, and there's 1 electron that goes in there. So the 1s is a subshell, the 2s is a subshell, and the 2p is a subshell. So there are different ways of showing how the electrons in fluorine are arranged. We can say that fluorine has 9 electrons. We can be a bit more sophisticated and use shells and say that electrons of fluorine are arranged 2 electrons, then 7 electrons. We can go a bit further and say that inside this shell and inside this shell there are subshells, and the electrons of fluorine are arranged 1s2, 2s2, 2p5. This is describing it in terms of subshells. And we can go further still and say the electrons in fluorine are arranged according to suborbitals, in which case we say they're arranged as 1s2, 2s2, 2px2, 2py2 and 2pz1.